Okay, so maybe I think time to start now. Welcome everyone to the April seminar. We have Ömer Özak presenting today, historical ethnic borders, basically the role of ethnic borders in conflict in Africa. Ömer, we have a total of 1 hour, so maybe 50 minutes of talk and 10 minutes at the end for kind of further discussions, but hope you're okay if people interrupt kind of for quick
Sure, sure,
questions.
sure. Depending on that, we'll see how much I actually get to cover.
Yeah,
I
sure.
never know. Okay.
I mean, if there are a lot of disruptions, then we'll push it kind of
Okay. Don't
more
worry. I mean,
time and stuff.
I'm usually very good at going over 100 slides in 20 minutes, so it's
All right. So this is
should work
like
okay.
a Jim Heckman kind of world you are in. Okay, so everyone, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have any, but if not, then please keep your microphones muted. Omar, this will be recorded and will be available on GLO website in a day or two.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, with that, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation, and also thank you all for coming to the talk. This is joint work with Emilio Depetris, who's at PUC Chile, and I'm Ömer Özak. I am at SMU. In case people wonder, sometimes they ask me, what is this R? We're part of the people who are trying to randomize names in the title of in the authorship, and luckily, again, Emilio is the first author as usual. So let me motivate our paper. As you know, conflict in Africa is a very prevalent phenomenon. It's been argued to be really one of the sources of underdevelopment in the region. And of course, this has raised a lot of theories and hypotheses as to what drives conflict in the continent. If you look at the literature, there seems to be consensus that, for example, ethnic tensions are really fundamental to understand intrastate conflicts. Also, the role of history and modern conflict seems to be a very prevalent theme in the literature. And finally, in terms of what's going to be mattering for our paper, the role of shared borders, right? And so there's a lot of theoretical work that argues that borders are really important for conflict because they create this opportunity for interaction, the willingness to fight, and they create all kinds of incentives for conflict, especially if you have valuable resources located at those borders, right? Interestingly, the literature has basically focused on national borders and interstate conflict, right? And so there are, like, I think, millions of papers written in basically covering that topic. Yet, so far, historical ethnic borders seem to have been omitted or completely ignored in this literature. And so when we started the project, we thought perhaps something wrong with us, or there's something interesting here. And in particular, we thought that the theories that we have created about the role of borders should generate similar incentives for conflict when you apply them to historical ethnic borders. Even worse, the fact that these historical ethnic borders tend to be de facto more than de jure should actually increase the potential for conflict, right? But it could be that perhaps no one has looked into this because it's not something that matters for conflict. Yeah? Yet if you ask Africans what is kind of a main source of conflict between groups, what you find is that boundary and land disputes are really essential, right? And this is especially the case for what are known kind of like small-scale, local, non-civil, basically conflicts where the state is not involved, which tends to be overlooked in the empirical literature. In fact, if you look at this type of non-civil conflict, they are almost half of all the events and of all the pairs of fighting groups in the data that we have. Moreover, these more local non-civil conflicts have the potential to escalate, and there are lots of examples where they escalate to actually civil wars, right? And so it seems like ignoring this type of historical ethnic borders and the type of non-civil conflict may be an important aspect of the problem that has not been studied, right? And so what we're going to do is basically start to understand whether historical ethnic borders affect the prevalence and intensity of conflict in Africa, And if we find some relationship there, we would, of course, try to like to understand why we actually observe this relationship, right? So let me give you kind of the conceptual framework from where we are coming from, right? So on the first hand, we know that historical ethnic homelands tend to be central to group identity. They highlight kind of this ancestral ownership of the land. And so people are really strongly associated with their homeland. And yet, historically, land was abundant and population was scarce, which meant that states or groups had really low incentives to control the land, which means that you should, in general, observe the emergence of soft borders, right? But in the last 200 years, the roles of land and population basically have switched, right? Africa has had a very late demographic transition, which has led to really rapid population growth, so that we've gone from about 74 million people in 1800 to 1.3 billion in 2019, right? This has been accompanied by low urbanization rates and high rural-to-rural migration, suggesting that the competition for resources on the continent has really increased a lot. Now, why do we think that historical ethnic borders matter for conflict? The fact that these borders were not really enforced, meaning that they are more de facto than de jure, makes them really soft, fuzzy, vague, poorly delineated, demarcated, and very porous, right? And we will try to show you some evidence to this. And this, of course, means that it's very conducive to conflict because it creates weak ethnic level property rights and also personal property rights, which creates overlapping claims on resources and allows interethnic contact and encroachment, right? So what are the main hypotheses that we will try to test in the paper? First, we want to show that historical ethnic borders play an important role in contemporary African conflict. And in particular, we should expect conflict to be more prevalent or more intense close to borders, especially for conflict that is related to land or territorial issues, authority, local or ethnic issues, right? We should expect conflicts to actually start close to border because that's where we expect all these forces to be stronger. And at the same time, we would expect that the effect of borders should be stronger if there's more reason to fight for the land around the border, right? Especially in the presence of valuable resources that are kind of linked to the territory, if there's been more population pressure on the border, or if you have groups that are more culturally similar, and thus they should be competing more closely for resources, right? At the same time, we would expect that the effect of borders should be mitigated if, for example, you have a strong coincidence with natural geographical barriers that may make them a little bit harder, even though they are not, let's say, institutionally hard. At the same time, we should expect that historical ethnic borders that overlap with contemporary de jure borders should also have less of an effect, suggesting that all these property right issues have been kind of resolved, or there's someone else that kind of implements these. At the same time, we should not expect historical ethnic borders to predict historical conflict if it's true that in the past, land was less important than population. And finally, we should expect that historical ethnic borders should not simply reflect the effect of ethnic diversity, right? And so we're going to try to test all these things. So what do we do in the paper? We basically explore this relationship between historic ethnic borders and conflict, right? Our main focus will be on non-civil conflict, that is conflict that doesn't involve the state, and also other subtypes, including local, communal conflicts. Right? We provide a model for ethnic border location, which we then going to use partly in our empirical setting to do. Yes. And in the empirical part.
Sorry, Ömer, since you got this interrupted, could I ask a question?
Sure.
So in terms of the conflict, I mean, I don't know, one hears it and reads a little bit, but what's the frequency and the intensity of conflicts across the border and kind of within the countries? Because you tend to hear a lot that within a number of countries in Africa, there is kind of ethnic tensions and kind of conflict and stuff. So is it just the border that is kind of determining that thing, or it is much more in a way, more than that. That ethnic element, even within the country, is the driving force, if you see what I mean.
I'm not fully sure if you're asking me whether we're distinguishing inter-country or interstate versus intrastate conflict.
Yes, that's exactly
all our conflicts are going to be intrastate. It's not, we're not going to have anything that's interstate. And moreover, intrastate, it's going to be only the type of conflict where the state of the country is not involved. So you don't have something like, let's say, what happens in Colombia, where you have the Colombian government fighting the FARC or something like this. So this is really about groups or very local kind of conflict that we're going to be looking.
Thanks.
And so what we're going to do is basically exploit very local data on conflict and the distribution of historical ethnic borders. And we're going to basically look at the continent using artificial geographical units that are basically cells of 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, right? And our analysis is going to be always within country, within ethnicity, so kind of trying to account for everything that's common to the country and the ethnic groups that we're looking at. And so if you're going to kind of think just in a picture, what our analysis is doing is we're splitting the continent into these cells that we have here marked in green. We're going to have our historical ethnic borders, which are here in blue, and we're going to have national borders, rivers, etc. And we're going to look at the location of conflict, and we want to see how much these two things are associated with each other. Then, of course, there's going to be a lot of, we're going to try to convince you that what we're finding is actually not simply a correlation, that there's really something causal there. And so we're going to use a model-based IB strategy to try to overcome, especially the problem of measurement error that we have in this setting, right? And then we're going to try to understand some of the mechanisms that we proposed, right? What we find, there's a very robust relationship between historical ethnic borders and this intrastate non-civil conflict, right? And so we find that the presence of a border increases both intensive and extensive margin of conflict, especially the types of conflict that are about local issues or ethnic issues. And we have a huge impact on the onset of conflict, so basically where conflict starts, conflicts over land and border demarcation, and interestingly, we find no effect on religious conflict. When we look at underlying mechanisms, we find that the presence of valuable resources, the fact that the border is fuzzy or hard, or whether there was a lot of population pressure and cultural similarity at the border are underlying mechanisms for our finding. So let me go into the empirical data and try to show you what we do. So as I said, we're going to exploit a cell-level data set where we have our cells from 50 by 50, which in this case means that we're splitting Africa in over 14,000 cells. And we're going to combine a lot of data sources. On the one hand, we're going to have geocoded conflict data that's coming from the two main data sources that are high quality, the ACLED and UCDP PRIO projects. We're going to use the historical ethnic borders, mostly from Murdoch map, although we do have other ethnic borders that we're going to use to try to check for robustness and other ethnic sources. We use the identity of ethnicities from the Murdoch map, which we can then link to cultural and language data from Ethnographic Atlas and Ethnologue. We're going to also use these to assign certain characteristics to the cell. We also will control for a large set of observables in terms of geography and climate. So think about topography, ruggedness, land suitability, diseases, water, distances to cities, all kinds of things. We also want to control for kind of resources, which are one of the main sources of conflict. And so we're going to control for like diamonds, oil, presence of minerals, etc. And finally, we also have national administrative borders that we're going to be accounting for. Let me tell you a little bit about our historical ethnic map that we're going to be using. So this was a map created by Murdoch in his 1959 book. The map was digitized by Nathan Nunn in 2008, and it's been used widely in the literature. And it's kind of interesting that the literature has never looked at the effect of historical ethnic borders, even though it's been using historical ethnic borders as an identification in kind of this regression discontinuity type of analysis. And so this is our map, which shows us basically the distribution of all ethnic groups in Africa, kind of in the pre-colonial era. right? Of course, no one really fully understands how Murdoch came up with this map, nor how he decided where the borders were located. So this really suggests that the borders may be really mismeasured, right? And given our setting, this will create really problems of non-classical measurement error. Okay. Now let me try to show you that even though we don't fully understand where this map came from, the borders seem to really represent, there's still information in these borders. There's something that's happening around these borders. And let me try to show you two pieces of evidence that kind of support some of the arguments we made before. First, if we look at individuals using DHS data, and we look at their ethnic identification, and we look at the share of each ethnic group that's living inside their homeland versus outside their homeland, what we see is that around the distance from the border, there's this discontinuity in the share of population from an ethnic group, right? So kind of suggesting that most of the ethnic group does indeed live inside the homeland. So kind of, again, this idea that the people really remain close to their homeland. There's this really strong attachment, but also that these pre-colonial borders kind of have at least survived somewhat into the present, even though no one knows where they are exactly. Second, kind of evidence that these borders are very porous and don't really separate groups very well, right? And so here we're looking not at the share of population from an ethnic group, but the share of the local population in each place that belongs to the ethnic group where this location is, of the homeland where this location is located, right? So if basically this is looking at whether this places close to about 5 to 10 kilometers from the border, what share of the population in that place belongs to the ethnic group whose homeland that place is located in, right? And what we see is that this kind of varies much more smoothly, right? Suggesting that in these things are very porous and people can move from one side to the other. Okay, let me now kind of show you a little bit of the evidence of the relationship between historical ethnic borders and conflict. First, here I'm going to show you the distribution of conflict events in relationship distance to various sources of conflict and other linear properties, and in particular our ethnic borders. And what we see here in red are our distribution of the distance of conflict events to ethnic borders, and we see that they are very close to ethnic borders. All the other potential sources of conflict or kind of other linear features, we see that the conflict doesn't seem to be associated with being very close. In fact, if I compare cells that have a border, historical ethnic border, with cells that don't have a historical ethnic border, the presence of a historical ethnic border is associated with basically twice as much conflict. Of course, this is just a correlation, and we know there's lots of challenges that we will need to overcome to show that this is really quite robust and perhaps causal, right? First, we have that borders are not really randomly assigned, right? And in particular, we know that the measurement error in Murdoch's map can be quite non-trivial. So how are we going to try to account for these, or try to resolve these issues? Or first, we're going to try to account for all kinds of observables, as many as we can. I think that this is quite large, and we have lots of robustness. In particular, covering kind of like everything that has to do with geography, climate, and other sources of conflict. Elena, yes, tell me.
Sorry, I was trying to open my mic. So I was just wondering, did Murdoch know some of these countries better than others? Because I could see, for instance, around West Africa, they're like more,
I don't think it's really about knowledge. It's really, I mean, Murdoch, what he did is basically do kind of like a literature review and bring together all the knowledge that was known. But that's kind of known. You see, of course, parts where you'd only have one ethnic group, which is basically because they are nomads, or they tend to be like the Sahara, let's say. Of course, then you have only one ethnic group. The number of groups is not driven by his knowledge of the groups, right? I think they tend to reflect what seems to be the truth in the ground. We also find similar results when you look at the number of ethnicities by country in the countries where you have this, looking at DHS data or Afrobarometer, or even if we look at other ethnic maps, let's say like Greg, right? Thank you. Okay, so I was saying we're going to basically account for all kinds of observables, right? We're going to exploit within ethnicity, within country variation, so kind of accounting for everything that's culturally, historically, institutionally common across the country and also within each ethnic group. We're going to perform some placebo analysis. We're going to vary our size of the cells to basically try to show that this is very robust no matter what the cell size that we're using. And finally, we're also going to exploit an instrumental variable strategy that's going to be based on our model that tells us where borders should have been located. And we use this to create kind of measures of potential borders to predict actual historical ethnic borders, right? So let me tell you a little bit about our instrument, which basically is going to help us overcome two issues, both the non-classical measurement error, but also, I will try to make the argument that it biases a little bit overcoming the issue of having omitted variables. So what we're going to do is the following, right? We have a model that basically we study where borders should be located when ethnic groups are deciding where to locate, and then have to fight to basically control a certain area. And what we find is that ethnic borders should create what's known as a Voronoi partition, right? And a Voronoi partition of the continent basically means that given the center of gravity of an ethnic group, every area that's closest to it should belong to them. The nice property of Voronoi borders is that they are based on the centroids of a homeland, right, or of a ethnic group. And this centroid really is a global property of ethnic homeland. So if you think that we're accounting for ethnic fixed effects, we're kind of accounting for this global property. Additionally, we have that Voronoi borders are a global property of the spatial distribution of all centroids, right? And so it's really not anything specific on one particular centroid. It really depends on the distribution of all the centroids together, right? And this suggests that the location of Voronoi borders should be independent of cell-level characteristics, right? Including geographical conditions, institutional, cultural, and ethnic characteristics, and the history of the place, right? And so we believe that once we account for country and ethnic fixed effects, we should get something close to conditional independence, right? Of course, we're going to be using one specific instrument. We show you that how we construct our instrument is, it doesn't really seem to matter. Our analysis is really robust to what we use as a centroids, how we construct these Voronoi partitions, etc. To give you a sense of what we're doing, imagine that this is the world. We have two ethnic groups with their ethnic homelands. We have their ethnic border here. Once we figure out a location of what's kind of the central location of an ethnic homeland, we can just split the world here into what's the area that's closest to the center of ethnic group A and ethnic group B, right? Which in this case basically would suggest that the Voronoi border has to go here. And notice that I don't need to know anything about the geography of the place. I don't need to know anything about the ethnic groups, right? So this kind of highlights why we believe that at least ex ante, you would expect that the location of the Voronoi border should be independent of anything that has to do with the cells where it's actually located. And so for our case, what we're going to do is take the ethnographic, Murdoch map, find the centroids of these ethnic homelands, and given the centroids, we're going to now construct the Voronoi partition of Africa. And we're going to use these potential borders to predict our historical ethnic borders. And we're going to do variations of this by using different centroids, by using different ways of measuring distance, etc. And we will basically get similar results. Let me show you. Yes, Mihail.
Yeah, I have a question. You did mention language. There could be different ethnicities which share a common or almost common language, and there could be different ethnicities which do not understand each other. So does it play a role in your models and actually also in actual
Well, let me go back to, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I guess part of what you're asking is what the definition of an ethnic group is, right? So here we basically are taking the ethnic groups as defined by Murdoch, which tend to be something like groups of people that are culturally similar, that speak a language that is common among them, right? At least when you look at in the linguistic tree up to level 6. And the other part, what I understand from your question, is whether places where two ethnic groups which speak similar or different languages, if that has a different effect on conflict. I will come back to this because that's actually one of our, I think what we think is one of our interesting results. Remember, one of our hypotheses is that if it's really about fighting for the competition for resources, we should expect more culturally similar ethnicities to actually fight more at borders than borders where the two groups are more dissimilar, right? And I will show you some evidence that it actually goes in this direction.
Okay, thanks.
Now, let me show you here a little bit correlations between contemporary conflict, ethnic borders, our Voronoi border, and the centroid, with various observables that come from geography that could affect conflict, as well as, for example, the presence of historical conflicts, population densities, the distance to the closest cities. And what we see here is that basically, while conflict and ethnic borders tend to correlate more with these observables, Voronoi borders and the centroid tend to be less correlated, and if they are correlated, the coefficients are quite small, right? So this kind of suggests a little bit that the plausible exogeneity it seems to be hold in our sample. Let me show you now first our first stage analysis based on the centroid of the homelands that we take from Murdoch map. And so here I'm showing you basically whether the fact that a cell has a Voronoi border predicts the fact that there is a historical ethnic border in that same cell, right? And so we see that the pure correlation suggests that having a Voronoi border increases the probability of you having an actual historical ethnic border by about 32%. We then add country fixed effects, continental ethnic fixed level fixed effects. We see that that consumes a lot of the variation. But then notice that once we account for country and ethnic fixed effect, adding additional controls basically has no impact on our coefficient, right? And that's, again, kind of suggestive of this conditional plausible exogeneity, right? We replicate this first stage with many different ways of constructing the Voronoi, right? And so here we have our main instrument that we're going to be using throughout, but then we use 3 different data sources for location of ethnicities. And so we use on a different atlas, the ethnographic atlas and Greg, to construct the location, the central location from other sources to construct our Voronoi borders, right? And so it kind of overcomes the problem that perhaps you would be using the geography that's coming from Murdoch to basically predict the centroid and then predict back, right? And so here we're going to be taking centers from other sources, use those to predict the location. Additionally, ethnographic atlas and Greg and atlas, they don't always have the same number of ethnicities, though this also provides a little bit of robustness to the fact that we take the number of ethnicities. Then we use, basically, within a homeland, we identify the most fertile location, and we use that as our centroid to produce our instrument. And what this allows us to do is basically looking at the most suitable place using one crop or across the average of all available crops pre-1500. Right? And finally, even though all of these, notice that we basically get very similar results, we would also like to see whether there is kind of a more structural thing that's happening and that maybe constraining where Voronoi borders should be located, right? And so while all of these are taking one centroid as given and then constructing with the Voronoi, we know that Voronoids create a lot of structure in the partitions. And so it doesn't always matter where the centroid is, the location of Voronoi borders may not change. So what we do in the last 2 columns is basically construct kind of a measure of what's the probability that you would have hosted a Voronoi border. So no matter where we were to put the centroids, or where ethnic groups would have decided to be their center, where should we find the Voronoi border with higher probability? And so basically what this is saying is that if our propensity to host our border was equal to 1, we should expect that in any random allocation of centroids, we should expect to find in that location a border, right? And in fact, notice that the coefficient is actually very close to 1, right? And so it kind of suggests that indeed there is something structural saying that no matter how you were to partition Africa, our border should go through that location. So let me show you now kind of our first set of results where we're showing the relationship between conflict and our measure of historical ethnic border, or the instrumented version, right? And so the first 2 columns here, we have the prevalence, or basically if there is conflict in the cell. And we see that in OLS, having a cell basically increases the probability of conflict by about 7 percentage points. Once we control for country and ethnic level fixed effects, adding additional controls, notice that basically changes the coefficient very little. Of course, we know that there's a lot of measurement error, so that's why we do our IV. And when we do our IV, notice that we get a very large significant coefficient. And again, similarly, we start with accounting by country and ethnic fixed level effects. Adding additional controls doesn't seem to affect our coefficient, right? Again, kind of suggestive of plausible exogeneity. And finally, then we also have 3 columns where we're measuring not only the kind of like the extensive margin, but also the intensive margin of conflict. And we find that indeed the presence of ethnic borders really increases the intensity of conflict also, right? And if we compare these to the mean prevalence of these different measures, we see that the coefficients are quite large, right? And it's suggesting that indeed the presence of a historical ethnic border has a really economically significant effect. We replicate this by using all our different versions of our IV, and we get basically the same results, right? And first, they are all statistically significant. And moreover, if we look at after accounting for our country and ethnic level fixed effects, additional controls don't seem to affect our estimate, right? And although the estimates vary a little bit, they're not really statistically that different, right? So this, again, kind of suggestive that the presence of historical ethnic borders seems to be very strongly associated with the presence of contemporary conflict. This is very robust. We do a lot of robustness in the appendix. I'm not going to bore you with all the checks that we do here. Let me instead kind of move into what are the mechanisms that we think may matter for this. Okay, we'll do the time. Okay, so the first thing we suggested was that the types of conflict and the start of conflict should be close to borders, right? And so here, I'm going to show you results that study first, how does the presence of ethnic border affect different types of conflict, and where we're going to be comparing it with basically the prevalence of that type of conflict, right? And so here we have the types of conflicts that we should expect historical ethnic borders to have an especially large effect on, right? And so if you look at, we have local conflicts, which are a subset of these non-ethnic, non-civil ethnic conflicts, conflicts about land, territorial conflicts, conflicts about authority, border, and territorial issues. Yes? I see a hand. Yes, Vincenzo.
Hi, Ömer.
How are you?
Nice paper. Do you have, maybe you are talking about this right now. Do you know why this jump in the IV coefficient is so large? Because it's like 10 times the OLS. Something about
it's 4 times the OLS.
Local
actually.
identification, something like this.
I mean, we have done, of course, it could be 2 things, right? It could be that indeed there is a lot of omitted variable bias that's driving this. I actually don't think that's the case, right? In some of our robustness, what we've done is basically constrain the analysis to only cells that are very close to border. So basically, you're comparing cells that have a border to cells that don't have a border that are next to it, right? And we basically find the same result. So I really don't think it has to do with kind of omitted variable bias per se. I think it's really mostly coming from non-classical measurement there, right? And to see this, think of the following. Imagine that our theory is true and the coefficient was equal to 1, right? And imagine you have 200 cells. Imagine you have 100 cells with conflict and borders and 100 cells without conflict and no borders. And now imagine we have fully misclassified all the borders. So now we have what we measure is places with conflict have no borders, places without conflict have borders. Now the estimate we would get is -1, right? Even though the true is 1, the estimate would be -1 because of this non-classical measurement error, because like the way we have our measures implies that the error is basically perfectly negatively correlated. And so this notice that has a huge impact. So, and we've done this at different levels because we've thought that changing the cell size may affect how much measurement error we get. And this ratio of OLS to IV being close to 4 is kind of constant, which again makes me think it's really about the measurement error, right? But really it's about, I think that the fact that this is non-classical measurement error may be driving the huge effect on the IV. Yes, Klaus.
No, just to reconfirm what you have already said, I guess. Conflict is only within conflict, no conflict across the borders, yes?
Yes. Not across the borders, not across national borders, right? So it's not about Ghana fighting their neighbors, right? It's about conflict that's happening in a certain place. So it could be that, for example, when we construct this measure of land conflict, we take in ACLED and we look for any conflict that mentions the word land. And so if you look at the entry, sometimes it's like the neighbors in this place where from one ethnic group has decided to go and fight with someone else, or it could be that this family was fighting with this other family because of some.
So it's within the territory or within the ethnic group, yes. It's not across ethnic groups. It's not.
That we cannot fully tell. I mean, we can do some changes and focus on, let's say in PRIO, you could try to identify if it's across. But this includes sometimes fights even within the same ethnic group, right? Because again, this is we can only do the analysis
between ethnic groups. I understand between ethnic groups, but within ethnic groups, that is a completely different picture. Now, can you be sure that in a territory there is only one ethnic group? I mean, often you can, yes. Are you so fine? You understand my point? Because when you really can group separate groups across ethnicities and this is all not overlapping, that's okay. I mean, but as soon as you have overlaps.
But actually, no. I mean, notice that it's the opposite, right? Notice that, remember the picture I showed you before where the share of the population that's local from the local ethnicity is kind of moving smoothly, right? So we have in most places a mix of people. And I will show you some extra evidence that in the end, there is a lot of this mixing, right? So,
yeah, but that is my point. You cannot distinguish between a conflict within an ethnic group or between ethnic groups.
But that's perfectly fine for us, right? Because in the end, what we care about is that no one knows exactly who the owner of these resources, right? And so let's say I may fight with, and this is let's say if we had finer grained ethnic maps, we could do something similar. And we had one historical ethnic map for one special case that we found where we could do this at the subgroup level, right? So when I talk to my African friends, for example, they tell me, oh yes, one part of clan may be fighting with the other part of the same clan just because, again, you have similar issues happening within ethnic groups across clans, right? And so the story I'm telling you is mostly about cross-ethnic in terms of the border, but this may affect really all kinds of local conflicts, right?
Okay, thanks.
So sorry, can I just pick on that part? I mean, I think what Klaus was saying is kind of what my interest is in terms of how do you define in a way the types of conflict. So, I mean, what's the difference between territory and border and territorial?
Those I'm taking from the literature. So there's like people, experts in PRIO that have studied this and tell me like, this is a conflict about territory, right? Which I guess I really don't understand the perfect difference between territory and border and territorial. Sometimes
these are...
it's more about who owns the thing, kind of institutionally, versus who owns the thing, kind of more in terms of how you exploit it, right? So one thing is, so for example, we found this case of people, ethnicities fighting to name the head of the town in a special place, right? Just because once you name that head, he has all the power to distribute resources in the location. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I understand, but I still think that there is a lot of correlation, my sense would be, and that's, I think Klaus's point.
I know, that's perfect. Yeah, of course.
Ethnic and territorial and authority are all probably correlate, you know, in the sense that they are all...
These are all subsets of the non-civil conflict. We're basically choosing and splitting it by... What changes is the mean prevalence of these, right? And so what I want you to take from here is not only that it correlates with subsets of the types, but it correlates much stronger, and the effect is much bigger for certain types of conflict, right? So if we go back to our coefficient here, it's about 0.27, so presence of the border increased by 27 percentage points. The average was about 22, I think, yes, right? And so it's a little bit over the mean. If you go by other types of conflicts, for example, ethnic conflict, it's twice the mean, right? If you go on land conflict, it's 50% more than the mean, right? And so this kind of suggestive to basically the idea that these types of conflict, precisely the types of conflict where you should expect a larger effect is where we find a larger effect, right? I completely agree. These are all very highly correlated. Plus, of course, they can be correlated because perhaps you and I start fighting over who is the one that should be naming the head of the town, but this will end up also causing problems on who is using the land, which then, right? And so all of these are really interrelated. I mean, and I completely agree.
Okay, thanks.
Then we see that basically, so with the types of conflict, we should expect that historical borders should have a strong effect, right? According to the theory that I told you. We do find this, right? And again, I think that the important thing is to compare it with the average, so kind of get a better sense of the economic importance of it. Interestingly, we don't find an effect on religious conflict. Of course, religious conflict is also much less prevalent, right? And so, but at least we think it's kind of nice because at the same time, religious conflict is not something that we should be linking to the type of story that we've been telling, right? Then we look at the probability that a conflict starts in a cell and the number of types a conflict started in a cell, right? Or the number of starts of conflict in a cell. And we see, again, this huge effect, basically twice the mean of the presence of historical border. Again, suggesting that conflict tends to start there because that's where you should have all these problems of competition for resources under the presence of basically soft borders. Right? So let me kind of go a little bit into other potential mechanisms, right? It could be that what we're capturing is just the effect of historical conflict that may determine where borders are, and these historical conflicts persist, and it's nothing about the border, it's really about historical. Or it could be that we're just capturing diversity, right? There's a huge literature saying that diversity is bad for conflict, right? And so here we're going to basically study this according to what we presented at the beginning. If land was really if population was scarce and land wasn't in the past, we should not expect to find conflict at borders. And indeed, that's what we find, right? There is basically no effect or correlation between the presence of a historical ethnic border and historical conflict. Still, historical ethnic conflict matters for contemporary conflict, but it doesn't affect our coefficient. We also look at whether the presence of historical conflict at a historical border may have a differential effect. And again, we don't find a significant effect, but the coefficient is negative, suggesting that at least if you and I fought in the past, perhaps we may have resolved these issues better, and you may see less of an effect of the border today. Then we look at the effect of contemporary diversity by first measuring just the number of languages that you have in a cell. And we see that there is no strong correlation between the presence on the ethnic border and just the number of languages spoken, or basically kind of contemporary groups, if you want. We see that the number of groups also doesn't seem to affect, right, and doesn't affect our coefficient either. Yet when we do the interaction, what we find is that more diverse locations where they have more languages seem to have less conflict, right? This could be partly reflecting perhaps population densities, etc. But borders where you have, or cells where you have more languages and a historical ethnic border, the effect of historical ethnic border increase, right? So in a sense, it potentiates the effect of the border. Moreover, if you look at not just the number of groups, but really the composition by looking at the ethno-linguistic fractionalization, which takes into account how many people are there from each group, we find that the presence of a historical ethnic border really impacts ethno-linguistic fractionalization, which again goes with the nice graph that I showed you, which was going down very smoothly around the border, kind of suggesting that you have a lot of mixing of people around the border, right? Interestingly, of course, if you control for ethno-linguistic fractionalization, we find that it has a positive effect on conflict, right? It doesn't really affect our coefficient. But when we do the interaction, first notice a very nice result. The presence of more diversity around the border increases the effect of conflict. And the more diverse the border, more conflict you will see. But you don't see any effect of diversity in places where you don't have borders. That is, again, even if you and I are very, let's say, if you take two locations that are similarly diverse, but one is far away from the border, you should not have these issues of who owns what and who should be allocating what, right? Private property issues should be resolved, while at the border, they are not resolved. And so we think that this is a very nice kind of evidence suggesting that we may be on the right track. Next, we're going to look at heterogeneity across the borders, but this heterogeneity is going to be, yes, Vincenzo.
Yes, thanks. Did you check for polarization instead of the fractionalization? There is this issue of having many small groups versus having two big groups, this stuff.
It's basically very similar. The results are almost identical. Yeah. Okay, so the next thing we want to look at is heterogeneity at borders, but here we're going to do a heterogeneity in a way a little bit different from what's the usual way in the literature, and I want to show you why we do it, right? So instead of doing the typical interaction of the presence of, let's say, the border and diamonds, or the border and our national border, we really need to identify how much, especially in the case of borders or rivers, or how much these two things overlap, right? Because our theory, for example, in terms of soft versus hard borders, suggests that the overlap of national borders with historical and ethnic borders provide the border to be harder than if they don't overlap. So think about this cell where you have national borders and historical ethnic borders. Notice that national borders here don't help us overcome this problem of resolving and making the ethnic border hard. It's still soft, right? Even worse, we know from the literature, by splitting these ethnicities, this may actually exacerbate conflict. Well, if you look at this cell, or in fact, any of these cells here, notice that national borders and historical ethnic borders kind of overlap. And of course, this means that in a sense, those ethnic borders are actually not soft, they're actually hard, right? And so we're going to try to, of course, this is all mismeasured, so we're going to try to recover how similarly the historical ethnic border is to the actual border or river, etc., by looking at what share of the length of the historical ethnic border in a cell is within some buffer of the river, the national border, etc. Okay. So first, we're going to look at heterogeneity on the presence of resources. So here in the first three columns, we're looking at whether having very highly productive agricultural land within 5 kilometers of the border. So this is controlling for the average productivity of the land in the cell. We're going to now look only at how productive that border is and compare, in a sense, cells that have borders with high productivity with borders that have low productivity, right? And we see that the presence of valuable agricultural land increases the effect of borders. Similarly, for minerals and oil, although the coefficient is positive, it's not really statistically significant, right? But if you look at agricultural land and minerals, their presence really close to the border really exacerbates conflict. Next, we're going to look at whether the coincidence of the historical ethnic border and some kind of geographical characteristic that may improve kind of like observability and kind of enforcement of the border it changes the effect of borders. And so here we look at ruggedness and how much they overlap with rivers. With ruggedness, we find, I mean, we would have expected, let's say, if the border is around ridge of mountains, perhaps that would help identify the border better and it would not be movable, et cetera. And so that may help overcome the problems of the border being soft. Of course, rugged areas have also strategic importance. So you kind of have these two ambivalent effects. We find a positive effect suggesting that perhaps the effect of increasing conflict is larger than the effect of helping us create a harder border, right? With rivers, we find no correlation. Again, I think there are two forces working here. On the one hand, rivers may help delineate better the border, but at the same time, we know there are kind of these upstream, downstream kind of effects which exacerbate conflict. So it could be that it works. And
sorry,
finally,
yes? 4 minutes. 4 minutes.
4 minutes. Oof, yeah. Yeah, I think I'm almost done. The last two columns, we're going to basically look at the overlap with borders that are more de jure. And what we find is that indeed, the more you overlap with these de jure borders, the lower the effect of historical ethnic borders. In fact, if you go from 0 to 100% overlap, what you get is that coefficient, the effect becomes insignificant, right? Kind of again, suggesting that it's about the fact that these borders are de facto. Then we look and present some evidence about population pressure. And so here we're looking at whether the increase in population between 1960 and 2005 is having an additional impact on the effect of border. And what we find basically is that across all kinds of conflicts, borders that have become more populous have more conflict, right? Again, suggesting that it is about this competition for resources, right? Then we look, and kind of going back to one of the questions before, we look at how much the fact that two ethnic groups that meet at the border, which are different, affects the effect of border. Our story was telling that if you are more similar, you should have more conflict because you're basically competing for the same resources. The less similar you are, you should have less conflict. And that's basically what we find here, where we're looking at, for example, using whether your subsistence strategy, how different they are across the border. We find that the more dissimilar the two ethnic groups are, the less conflict you can see. We measure this using subsistence. We use linguistic distances at different levels. We find the same results. We use all the cultural data from the ethnographic atlas. We get kind of a similar result, right? And so the conclusions is basically that well, historical ethnic borders and conflict is kind of a question that's been omitted in the literature. We have a very robust pattern. We find a very large effect, and we provide evidence that characteristics of the border matter, right? So similarity across the border increases conflict. We find that conflict is larger at fuzzy versus hard borders, and especially high in places where you've had a lot of population pressure. And I think I finished right on time.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you. Any further questions, Klaus?
Yes. So I have a more broad question. Your definition of conflict is very broad. Yes. Now, have you looked at civil wars as one kind of conflict? I ask this because your research seems a little bit in conflict with traditional work on conflict. Yes. Let's say the greed and grievance approach of Collier and Hochschler, for instance, has been very prominent in the past. It's a long time ago, and they haven't looked so much at causality, I guess. But they come up with something where ethnicity is not playing so much a role. It's more, let's say, access to resources to create civil wars. What is your view on this?
I think, I mean, I don't think they are contradictory, right? I mean, in a sense, and I think that that's something that's our kind of what we want to go next, is the link between these non-civil conflicts and civil conflicts, right? So I said, I mean, there are examples of many non-civil conflicts that start small and very quickly end up engulfing the whole country, right? And so even the example that I was telling you, which is basically it's two ethnicities. I mean, it's kind of a story I had never heard, kind of like this two ethnic groups that are fighting to put the headman of a town, which is a little town in the middle of nowhere with no, like, there's nothing that from the satellite view you would say like you should be fighting over this. And these are kind of two sub-ethnic groups starting to fight. And this just escalated at the national level in Namibia overnight. And so it was basically one thing that they had to, luckily they resolved quickly, but otherwise it would have escalated very quickly to the national level, right? So we really believe that a lot of these local things may escalate and explode very quickly, right? So I'm sure, I mean, and we've done it. I mean, we can basically run regressions with civil conflict or with total conflict, not distinguishing, and we will find also high correlations. Of course, the correlations may be a little bit smaller compared to the average than what we find here, right? So again, this is about kind of where we think that the effect should be. In the end, when I'm fighting about one thing, we may end up fighting about other things also, right?
Okay, thanks.
Camille.
Hi, Homer. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I personally always find fascinating all the studies about ethnic borders and current conflict in Africa. I've got two questions about your mechanism and subsequent interpretation of your finding. So the first one is quite simple, is do you have some cells where there are actually multiple ethnic borders in the same cell, and what does it mean for the interpretation of your result? And the second one is more about how exactly are those historical ethnic borders being created? I'm thinking maybe this has a link with livelihood zones. So even beyond agricultural zones, there is a correlation between ethnic groups and the economic role they have in the economy. So have you tested the presence of livelihood zones beyond agricultural ones? There is also the livestock sector also that is interesting. And similarly, what could it mean for your result? Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we've done, I mean, we measure borders in many, I mean, here just because the interpretation is much easier, we use the presence on presence, right? Presence of conflict and presence of ethnic borders. We've done the borders using the length, the number of borders, and usually, for example, when we construct these cultural distances, we're looking at the average cultural distance across all ethnic borders that are present in a cell, right? Of course, once we go to smaller cells, that tends to be that you only, in general, you tend to only have one border and not that many, right? At our level of 50 by 50, there are many locations where you have more than one border, right? But we do show that the results are basically identical. We instrument in the same way using the Voronoi borders, etc. In terms of livelihood, I mean, we first account for ethnic fixed effect. So if the ethnicity, whatever characteristics of the ethnicity we are controlling for with that, right? Now, of course, you could think that perhaps what we did in terms of value of agricultural land, we could have done something similar if that was like pastoralist land or something like this, right? But that just would require us to have a good proxy for the potential for these other sources of economic activity, right? So if you have a suggestion, I'm happy to use that. I mean, it's hard to find a good proxy for these potentials, right? That's why we use agricultural land as a proxy. You can imagine, of course, that if we had both land that's highly suitable for agriculture and pastoralism, so for example, the last effect of cultural distances may be a little bit different in those locations, right? Because now you would have places that both groups may actually be willing to fight, because now there is a little bit less complementarity and more competition, right?
I think you can give a try to the literature on heather and farmers conflict. There is think a work by McGurk and Burke recently that is using some kind of livelihood zones between pastoral, agro-pastoral and agricultural lands. And something you can give it a try. The issue is always that when you're looking at Africa as a whole, it's difficult to have this
That's why,
sufficient
I mean, like,
precision.
let's say Nathan Nunn recently used, I think it's I can't remember what's called. It's like the net primary production as a proxy for pastoralism, I think.
Yeah.
So one could do that, right? Of course. Right.
Okay, it's perfect time to stop. Thank you so much, Ömer, for a very nice presentation and a great paper. And thank you everyone for participating. So until next month, goodbye all.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.